Alright, so it's been a good long while since the Apple TV breakout hit Ted Lasso came to an end, with its third season at the very least complicating, if not utterly shattering, what could have been a strong, straightforward, unique TV legacy. Regardless, some fans insist that it was and remains incredible, while OG naysayers maintain that it was always cheesy garbage. But I think there were many who, like me, thoroughly enjoyed the first season and then sort of lamented the show's downfall. So obviously, this video is for everyone and anyone who's interested, but my aim here in particular is to have a look at what went downhill in terms of storytelling. The problems with this show's culmination ran deeper than just, we don't like the stuff that happened, or the writing was not as good. I found that as we take a look under the hood of this show, there seems to be something intrinsically flawed with its creative approach, perhaps since the very beginning. So, for those who don't know, Ted Lasso actually started out as a 2014 NBC commercial character, a quick little promo skit, and with his then-wife Olivia Wilde's encouragement, Jason Sudeikis, showrunner and of course Ted himself, developed his one-off buffoon guy into an entire story. And given that rather unusual genesis, given that this was one of Apple TV's first real swings as a streaming platform, given that this was new authorial territory for Sudeikis, I imagine that in his creating, Sudeikis copiously planned out just one season. I don't think anyone could have predicted that it would turn into the huge phenomenon that it did, and we also know that as a Saturday Night Live veteran, Sudeikis likes to employ a very improvised, sort of ad hoc creative approach. This style of collaboration and writing is probably what landed us with some of the best Ted Lasso one-liners, but as we'll see, when it comes to storytelling fundamentals, a problematic lack of organization and sort of blatant disregard for basic principles definitely undermined Ted Lasso's final season. There were, of course, some other real-life factors in play too, with some key writers diverting their attention to new projects, and some pretty obvious maneuvers to platform potential backdoor pilots for in-universe spin-offs. Though actually, as I'm writing this, there are some murmurs of a Season 4, probably without Sudeikis, kicking around, so who knows what'll happen. And I know from reading dedicated defenses of this show that many viewers see a lot of value in easy-to-watch, comfortable, uplifting, optimistic TV, and I get that. But my experience with Season 3 was not easy. It was one of deep frustration, precisely because I felt very strongly that Ted Lasso at its best was not actually easy to watch. I mean, it was never a cerebral labyrinth, but it was at times emotionally challenging for the audience. Season 1's use of subverting our expectations and continually highlighting the central theme, that season is very sweet, rather cheesy, sure, but people who wrote it off from the tone alone were, I think, really missing out on a cleverly oriented audience experience, and on the compelling power of a hero defined by his empathy as both a strength and a weakness. That's interesting stuff. And though this video is certainly criticizing the show as a whole, I want to be clear that I was definitely charmed by the initial atmosphere, and a handful of moments in particular remain genuinely moving to me. I have plenty of warm memories of watching this show with friends and family, and though Season 2 was sort of a rockier road, it worked for me. It really wasn't until Season 3 that it became impossible to deny the allegations that it pretty much sucked. And one obvious problem that also indicates lack of planning is that Ted Lasso had a really confused formal identity. Obviously, this season comprised episodes of absurd and irregular length. Again, sort of a lack of story discipline there, but even the genre was confused. Honestly, with its weekly moralizing and cartoonishly jaunty, childlike adults, this could have been a pretty good kids show or a family show, but it's bizarrely punctuated by overtly sexually explicit jokes that contribute pretty much nothing. And with its initially tight narrative focus and promise of an optimistic yet bittersweet character study, this could have been a neat, Fleabag-esque 3-act story, and that's sorta what various show writers promised us in interviews. But then, despite those longer episode runtimes, Season 3 sprawled into what felt like an ensemble sitcom, unhinging itself from both topical and thematic centrality, piling subplot after subplot, mimicking both the narrative style and didactic tone of Sesame Street more than anything else. A robust lack of artistic and formal identity and purpose made Season 3 hard to get truly invested in, and I know some people were excited to relax with it week by week, and if this show is your personal cup of comfort, great. I do admire its tender approach to simple human truths and its dedication to bringing more good into the world. I was rooting for it, but on the other hand, guys, there are plenty of other shows out there that champion kindness with optimistic idealism. Just because they don't have a fat sticker on them announcing that they do so doesn't mean that they're not. And as Season 3 of Ted Lasso was coming out, I really had to make myself watch episode by episode. Look, it's fine to play around with genre and form, it's welcome even, but there's a difference between intentionally subverting or manipulating TV storytelling practices and just blatantly disregarding them. And this is not at all a comparison video to The Bear. But hey, they are both stories about someone who swoops in as the new leader of a group of people who aren't at all welcoming, who is defined by one particular professional ethos that slowly wins people over, who had a family member die by suicide and intergenerational trauma. They both focus on underdog ragtag teams in hyper-competitive industries. They both have a female character counterpart who understands the hero on some special level. They both give their ensemble cast plenty of spotlight, and the reason The Bear is blowing critics and audiences away on a level that the final season of Ted Lasso just didn't does not, I think, have anything to do with very different tone or pacing. It's in the build. It's in the fundamentals of the craft of storytelling that The Bear uses with exceptional dexterity, and that Ted Lasso improvised along the way, presenting a pretty stellar first season, but massively fumbling the latest. So this video is going to look at 3 crucial storytelling fundamentals and how they were bungled in Season 3, especially in contrast to Season 1. Though it is increasingly clear that from the get-go, the story foundation itself had plenty of cracks. To me, these 3 reasons kind of explain why Season 3 felt so unengaging and bizarre. So we'll start with narrative persuasion, and having an idealistic, persuasive effect was probably the only constant to this show's identity, so that one's pretty key. Then character work, and finally the Ted Lasso Universe, or story world. Spoilers ahead, and as a reminder, at the start of Season 3, Richmond are back in the Premier League, Ted and Michelle are settling into divorced life, Keely has launched her own PR company, Nate has joined the dark side, aka West Ham, and, Rebecca and Roy are also there. At the end, Ted heads on home to KC with some potential Michelle reunion going on, maybe, we don't know. Nate's back as Kitman, and, that's about it. Yeesh, it was a rough season, guys, but let's get to it, and please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have, welcome back.
Something would pop into my head, but nope, absolutely nothing. No truth bomb this year.
The moral basis of Ted Lasso, what Robert McKee might call the controlling idea, is a huge feature of this show's identity. And it's super simple. It's just that kindness wins. Maybe not games, maybe not always, it's not always straightforward, but kindness wins. This is the purest form of the story that is Ted Lasso. And it's the concept that should transcend the episodes themselves and land in our own hearts and minds seamlessly as the audience. Now, for any show, it's not enough, obviously, to just announce a moral lesson. Good storytelling makes us feel it on our own terms in our own lives, and it's the show's job to dramatize the controlling idea. That's the difference between resonant TV storytelling and, those just say no skits in school assemblies. Sure, those skits might use fictional characters, but they're blatant mouthpieces for announcing authorial intent. The controlling idea has to be something we deeply feel, not just intellectually understand. And the way to do that, as a screenwriter, is through narrative design. The idea is reflected in the shape of the story and in how the core thesis triumphs over its opposite. Season 1 has tightly centralized, neat narrative structure with clearly established material stakes that make way for some beautiful character moments and persuasive communication of the show's controlling idea. The basic premise of the show opens obvious stakes. Will this underdog American succeed in getting Richmond to the top, or will Rebecca get her revenge by tanking the whole season? As Ted wins characters over, we realize that the foundational material stakes are just a platform for something more meaningful. But having those underlying stakes this season has multiple benefits. Crucially, every episode challenge contributes to both the material goal and the moral persuasion. So, obstacle, Sam Obisanya is underperforming. That's a problem. Ted needs to coach him, and Ted's not going to focus on technique or drills. He's going to make Sam feel at home. And it works, so we get to know both Sam and Ted, and then Sam becomes a better player, which in turn helps Richmond perform well, which informs the broad stakes of the season. It's a sort of loss for Rebecca. All the episodic obstacles build tension in that same direction. But the material stakes, Richmond's plot this season, were just a platform for the core emotional story, which centers Rebecca's arc and Ted's consistent ethos, and more on that later. But it's crucial to note that the shape of this season's story is intrinsically wound up in that core controlling idea. In material terms, it's a downward trajectory since Richmond are relegated, but that's just the material plot, and we're here for the story, which is that kindness can win. Additionally, while evil Rupert does loom around, this season's enemies weren't physical, they were internal. Rebecca's biggest obstacle is her own grief. Characters grapple with pressure, heartache, loneliness, anxiety, so even though the show is really goofy and the premise is sort of silly, let's be honest, Season 1 lands with an emotional resonance. Accountability, forgiveness, kindness, these things triumph over their opposites that are represented in very real, reasonably complex forms. Season 3, however, takes a wildly decentralized approach to both broad structure and episodic stakes, weirdly sidestepping any overarching material stakes in favor of a bizarrely disjointed jumble of subplots that cohered neither topically nor thematically. Richmond are back in the Premier League, and sure, I support them by default, obviously, but there's nothing dramatic compelling me to do so. At the start of the season, the only person who seems to really care about how Richmond does is Rebecca, and her motivation is rooted in a need to beat Rupert that felt too redundant for me to transfer my affection for her into caring how Richmond does. It's also echoed by other characters like Keeley. And as Ted mentally checks out and wonders out loud, explicitly, over and over, what he's still doing there, I start to ask myself the same question. It felt like they assumed audience investment, but even the most prestige beloved shows have to make us care about material stakes to work, even if the point is, like in Season 1, that they ultimately don't matter. And that's just Richmond. Why the heck should I care about Keeley's PR firm? What does this have to do with anything? Yes, I like Juno Temple, and it would be weird to root against her, but I'm not particularly invested in her success either. And where Season 1 stuck to a simple controlling idea, Season 3 appointed itself as the mouthpiece for the concept of the good, taking on homophobia, racism, xenophobia, corporate greed, global economic manipulation, sexual harassment, privacy rights, immigration politics. It's been said 100 times by thousands of people, but this was a lot for a 12-episode comedy, and none of these very intense issues were given the time or latitude to be represented comprehensively, meaning kindness doesn't triumph over anything dramatically meaningful. The material stakes on an episode-to-episode basis were cranked up to 11, but this ended up damaging the show's narrative capacity. There was no space for subtext, no chance for audience internalization. Sure, these might be issues that matter to you, I mean they should be, and that's why they'll sort of feel important, but that's us bringing the real world into the show. That's the show leaning on our existing social opinions for quick moral payoff instead of striving to actually affect our deeply held perceptions. For a few examples, so in Season 1, Ted has to grapple with the end of his marriage, and it's made all the more heartbreaking by how enormously low the material stakes seem to be. Michelle is lovely, their relationship seems warm and loving, but Michelle just can't summon what she once felt. I loved this choice. The dramatic antithesis to the show's controlling idea feels very real. So Ted's persistent commitment to his moral outlook is all the more compelling. In Season 3, the big relationship obstacle is a categorically unethical, super negative boyfriend that neither Michelle nor her son Henry seem to even like. Sam Obisanya isn't just feeling displaced and a bit conflicted, he's also squaring off against a powerful billionaire, a xenophobic politician, racist vandals, all of which absolutely matter in real-world terms, of course, but none of them are given the dramatic depth of his very simple homesickness in Season 1. And yeah, it was super nice to see, for example, Colin be entirely accepted by his teammates. It was super nice to see a group of men all agreeing that they should delete sexually explicit photos from previous relationships. But that scene in particular functioned just like one of those school assembly skits. Instead of dramatizing an idea through story structure, the show overtly articulated it through fictional voices. That's nice, but it's just not storytelling. It might have social value, but not artistic value. And not even Nate was given something meaningful to overcome, which he was set up to do this season, and we'll come back to him, but his arc should have been the core communicator of the show's controlling idea. His decision to screw Ted over and join the dark side was the biggest refutation of Ted's ethos and Ted himself. So how can we come back from this? What does the show have to say about that? Nothing. There's nothing seductive or compelling or nuanced about West Ham or Rupert or Nate's new world. They're just cartoonish embodiments of evil. Not even bad, not even darkness, just evil. And even for shows with less crucial moral backbone than Ted Lasso, good storytelling is intrinsically persuasive. All good stories are forms of rhetoric, and the great ones dramatize their core truths without announcing that they're doing so. So I'm going to cite Robert McKee again here. He's a screenwriter and amazing teacher. So, quote, "When your premise is an idea you feel you must prove to the world, and you design your story as an undeniable certification of that idea, you set yourself on the road to didacticism. In your zeal to persuade, you will stifle the voice of the other side." End quote. So in this case, in this third season, kindness doesn't triumph over anything dramatically meaningful, and the narrative entirely failed to persuade.
You really have to see to understand, and then even when you see it, I don't necessarily know that understanding is what we're doing.
Season 1 of Ted Lasso presented pretty solid character work, with firmer delineations between main, supporting, and background roles, and a clear use of character arcs to deliver that controlling idea. But throughout Season 3, it became abundantly clear that the showrunners were just making up rules as they went, doing whatever they felt like, whenever they felt like it. And the biggest problem here is in the confusion between what screenwriter Anthony Mullins calls constant characters and change characters. Constant characters like Paddington, Mary Poppins, Erin Brockovich, they can be the core drivers of plot action without undergoing significant internal changes. Even under significant pressure, they don't make decisions that are new or unfamiliar to their core original being. Erin Brockovich rises to immense occasion, of course, but the point is that she stays true to herself. Change characters, however, might undergo the prototypical hero's journey or just a slice of it, like Fleabag, Lady Bird, Maria von Trapp. They at some point make decisions that are unfamiliar to them. And this concept of the decision is a storytelling fundamental, more so than any characterization, more so than backstory or quirks or mannerisms, more so than anything really. Decision-making under pressure is the greatest teller of deep character in screenwriting. It's a common build for strong stories to have one constant character affect change in someone else, and that's what we have in Season 1. So Rebecca is the ostensible antagonist of the season, driving action against our hero Ted. Every win for her is a loss for him, but because her negativity comes from a place of vulnerability, we don't so much root against her as we root for her to change. But she's dead set on her relatively stupid revenge plot. Pressure mounts throughout the season for her to change, Sassy visits, Keeley confronts her, Higgins resigns, and of course Ted earns her respect. But over and over, she decides to stay on track until this pressure just becomes too much, and she makes the unfamiliar decision to confess and apologize.
I lied to you. I hired you because I wanted this team to lose. I wanted you to fail. And I sabotaged you every chance I've had.
Now, as tension towards this decision has been growing, I think we all expected something big and bad to happen when Ted found out. How many times have we seen a story where a relationship grows, but one of them has been lying the whole time, and then there's a big explosion at prom or whatever? But Ted, under significant dramatic pressure in this scene, stays true to his core self.
I forgive you.
You what? Why?
Divorce is hard.
His relentless commitment to empathy affirms him as a prototypical, constant character this season. His narrative job is to affect the world around him. But even under conditions of hostility and distrust, Ted remains the same. I love this scene, and it's morally persuasive. I sort of felt humbled by Ted's forgiveness here myself. Like, oh yeah, that's what kindness is. We shouldn't have expected something bad, of course. And we know that Jason Sudeikis was inspired by Mary Poppins, so it stands to reason that this strong first season was structurally inspired by the idea of that constant character being a beloved newcomer. This is a classic character trope, Hoosiers, Dead Poets Society, To Sir with Love, but season 1 absolutely communicates that Ted will have to undergo inner change before this show is done. This show is pretty consistently good at backstory, and the reveal that Ted has very unresolved childhood trauma from his father's death beautifully complicates his identity. And he struggles with anxiety, maybe alcoholism, maybe depression, and then season 2 takes a pretty solid swing at cracking those open with the introduction of Dr. Sharon. They have a wonderful dynamic, and Ted is definitely starting to change as he decides to be more openly vulnerable. I do think that introducing a therapist is sort of a shortcut to demonstrating character depth, as Dr. Sharon can just explicitly spell out, the fact that Ted intentionally guides people into underestimating him as a defense mechanism. That is such an interesting idea, and I really would have preferred to see that dramatized through story, but the writing and Sarah Niles' performance are definitely good enough to get away with it, and I get that part of the point here was to show the importance of seeking help in this way, so that's fine. But now we get to season 3. And I'll talk a little bit about the nonsense decisions for some supporting roles, but even more so than season 2, season 3 opens with an explicit pathway for Ted to be definitively a change character. He's affected his new world. The chairs have turned red. Everyone's sort of talking the way he talks. And now it's time to understand how his new world has in turn affected him. Now, Rebecca doesn't have much to do this season, much to my dismay. She's sent on an insultingly dull fortune teller subplot. Can't even get started with that, but this season has another change character to redeem, and that's Nate. So how will these two character arcs work? Well, Ted starts the season explicitly asking himself and everyone around him if he's a mess and what he's still doing in London. He came here, and like Rebecca's revenge plan, it is sort of tenuous, but he came to London with the idea that giving Michelle an ocean of space would somehow save their marriage, but it didn't work. So what's he now doing so far from home? It's painfully explicit, and certainly would have worked better as background, sort of slow burn subtext, but a phone call with Dr. Sharon suitably sets up Ted's biggest obstacle before he can go home. He doesn't quit things.
Sometimes wonder what the heck I'm still doing here. I mean, I know why I came, but it's the sticking around I can't quite figure out.
You don't quit things, Ted.
Right.
I'm not entirely compelled by this obstacle, but because it's tied back to his father's death, it's tied back to everything from season 1, it does work well enough, and it's obviously an internal hurdle. So how is Ted going to get himself to the point where he can quit this job? Meanwhile, after the end of season 2 saw Nate make that bold, character-altering decision to screw over Richmond and join West Ham, how will he come back into the light, and how will these two things work together? Well, sadly, they're both pretty much ready to make their final decisions right at the start of the season. Ted just about announces to everyone that he's mentally checked out, and as many others have noted, he's absurdly still clueless about the sport of football. He hasn't even heard of Zava. This is so frustrating, and it's a humor card they definitely should have packed away in early season 2 at latest, but it also means that Ted is narratively sidelined, and he's just killing time until the finale comes. Even that potentially really intriguing idea that Rebecca might have to fire him because he's just so bad at his job is brought up and then immediately resolved through the Zava trade, a problem that keeps happening this season. Problems get raised and then solved immediately. Overall, though, Ted's archetypal constant character was catapulted into a change arc without any storytelling legwork to support that change. They even undo earlier character growth by having Ted weirdly obsess over Michelle's new boyfriend. And Ted never connects his new foreign sport, his new life in London, to his own self. To my endless frustration, he's not affected really by anyone that he coaches. What if through Roy's mentorship, Jamie realizes that he doesn't actually love football and he just plays to show up his dad? What if that helps Ted in turn realize that his obsession with never quitting is likewise about about proving something to his absent father? What if both Jamie and Ted set themselves free by quitting? Or not, that's just one idea. We have an entire panoply of coachable players who could in turn help Ted with his inner growth. And you know what? The show absolutely knew that Ted didn't dramatically earn his decision to quit because they didn't even bother to show us the damn scene. They can't! It was unwritable because nothing changes from that opening airport scene in season 3, episode 1, and the finale. He flies off like Mary Poppins, leaving Trent with the note that it was never about me. But it was, Ted! Yes, it was! We spent a full season in therapy with you. We watched you struggle through panic attacks, deep vulnerability. You were a humble, all-American barbecue dad who zipped straight to one of the most prestige jobs in the UK, and you're telling me it was never about you? You're just sort of done? What a catastrophically dull ending to an initially inventive and very exciting character. Look, the hero's decision to either leave or remain in their new special world is a big one. And, for a beautiful sitcom delivery of this, look at Fran Fine in The Nanny, who gets a tempting offer to go back to her old life, but then realizes she's outgrown it. It doesn't matter, though, which path they choose, as long as we understand why and feel like we're a part of that inner decision. And if Ted isn't going to have any inner growth this season, fine, I guess, fine. But then don't crack open his inner psyche for us to care about, and certainly don't announce in the first episode that he's done here. Perhaps even a bigger disappointment, though, was the show's handling of its biggest promise for season 3, Nate's redemption. I don't have to spend too much time here because it's actually all pretty obvious. Even as the season opens, we sense Nate's discomfort with his decision. As I've already mentioned, Ted Lasso was incapable of presenting a remotely compelling antithesis to its own core ethos, but the question remained exactly how Nate was going to escape both his material circumstances, he's sort of locked in there, and his problematic inner dispositions. Like Rebecca in season 1, Nate was clearly supposed to be someone that we don't particularly hate, but rather hope to see change. However, Nate was riddled with a darkness that Rebecca never possessed, that was represented by spitting, by shouting at subordinates, so redeeming him is a much taller narrative order, so we had a lot of work to do this season. But instead of having Nate navigate his own journey of slow realization and moral reckoning, instead of a psychologically compelling change character story that re-emphasized the show's controlling idea, Ted Lasso leaned on inherently weaker writing shortcuts. I don't have any problem with Jade, and okay, I get it, she's not shallow, she's something Nate can't acquire, and the implication is sorta that Nate realizes power isn't everything because this girl doesn't care about his job title, which to me is a pretty subpar idea for this show, but if that's what they want to do it, go all in. For that matter, have Nate pursue Keeley like he has in the past, and maybe that could be a way to tie in this season's sort of pseudo-theme about money and power, as maybe Keeley could tell Nate those things aren't everything, but she realizes that she's actually being seduced by Jack in that way, and maybe Rebecca could be involved since she has a past with Rupert in that capacity. I don't know, I mean, that's not a subplot that I'd want to see, but at least it would be interwoven with people that we already care about. We also have to recognize that adding backstory, which again is a tool of characterization that this show always does well, is not, however, the same thing as telling a story in our moment. I don't forgive Nate just because I see more of his dad. His past should add to, not comprise, the bulk of his journey. We then hurried through the team's forgiveness of him, and I will say, again, they whipped out Beard's backstory absolutely perfectly here, but the rest of the team is just sort of forced to forgive him with very little time left in his season, and Nate is slotted right on into his original position. I would have even preferred if he took over as Richmond head coach. This is like a Kendall Roy Shakespearean look what I gained then lost cycle story, except the character didn't have an Icarian tragic fall because we never saw him close to the sun. It's immediately telegraphed this season that Nate is not fulfilled at West Ham. He tries to apologize as early as episode 4, and his major decision to join the dark side is played off as a whoopsies, that was a bit silly, wasn't it? Come on, let him be a villain, do the work. Stories that demonstrate characters choosing the good, even when they're genuinely comprehensively tempted by the bad, can change the world. I truly believe that. And once again, they hide the character-defining resignation scene from us. If this arc were taken seriously, not just Nate, but Ted, Beard, everyone really, would be better for it. The emotional power of any protagonist and their driving ethos should be accelerated by at least intriguing, if not equally powerful, forces of antagonism. And making Nate more likable and sympathetic through a working-class girlfriend and a violin does nothing to that effect. So to me, the handling of Ted and Nate in this third season, particularly when contrasted to the nice symmetry of Ted and Rebecca in season 1, were the biggest character disappointments. And I don't have time to walk through everyone else. Rebecca, though, would be third on my disaster list, though seeing Hannah Waddingham romantically relax in Amsterdam was, of course, lovely. Plus, Hannah Waddingham just owns every room she walks into, so it's always going to be magnetic even when the writing is bad. But, you know, Keely's relationships used to be growth opportunities for that character, stepping into new understandings of respect and accountability. And I don't just mean romantic, I'm of course including friendships here. And again, the show sidestepped meaningful development to include yet another boring romantic interest and Keely's weird side friend Shandy, who came and left with absolutely no dramatic impact on Keely. What did we learn from Jack? That rich people sometimes use their money problematically? Okay, but what does that have to do with anything? We already understood that with Rupert and Rebecca. And what about Keely changes from this? After Jack pulls funding, the one takeaway Keely could have had would be not to mix business with pleasure. And I mean, even that would be a pretty random show lesson that I don't care about, but then Keely goes ahead and accepts business funding from Rebecca. What the hell was that? Why did we spend any time on this? And what a waste of a great character. So season 1 made strategic use of guiding the audience into making certain assumptions. And then, as she steps into being not only nice, but also intelligent and ambitious, our own relationship with her is part of the dramatic effect. Again, that is dramatizing an idea. Be curious, not judgmental. Joke's on us for making bad assumptions. But with all the new characters this season, we were left with no room to make our own evaluations on any of them. Characterization wasn't a shortcut trick to guide us and then subvert our expectations meaningfully. It was it. Look, Babs collects snow globes. We have to love her now. I could go on and on with the jumble of supporting characters that were thrown onto rungless ladders to nowhere. But again, re-emphasizing this season's problem with narrative persuasion, even background characters like Higgins and May became Muppet-like voice pieces for explaining authorial intent, dropping wisdom-laden monologues that absolutely, yes, contained solid truths and were frequently pretty well written, but that's not storytelling. That's puppeteering, which made it really hard to enjoy even my personal favorites. Again, these monologue moments often embody ideas that we all like. And of course, the acting performances were all pretty wonderful, so as you're watching, say, Rebecca yell at Roy, the music and the mood make the scene feel meaningful.
You're just so convinced that you don't deserve anything good in your life that you'd rather eat a bowl of soup and then complain about the portions. Get out of your own way, man.
Okay, so Roy's big problem is that he gets in his own way because he doesn't think he deserves happiness, and that's why he didn't do the press conference? Didn't we spend season 2 with him even overzealously pursuing happiness with Keely and undergoing 2 major career changes to pursue joy while healing his relationship with the sport he loves? I love you, Rebecca, but what the hell are you talking about? I actually felt like I knew characters like Jamie, Keely, Roy, Sam, Higgins. I knew them better before this season, which is quite uncomfortable as an audience member. And I continued to enjoy more background characters like Jan Maas and Isaac, but with everyone in on every joke and every note this season, their individuality started to melt away. Look, it is definitely really hard to pull off the symmetrical yet subversive character arc work that was the bedrock of season 1, so credit there where credit is due. But simple character consistency is not a delicate challenge, and I can't forgive season 3 for bungling up some of my favorite characters just to get a fractured mix of pseudo-emotional monologue scenes. Overall, the initial dedication to carefully balanced change and constant characters got scrapped in the undisciplined grab bag of unrelated subplots. Deep character decisions were buried in favor of cutesy surface characterization and likability, and the concept of dramatizing meaning through character arcs was lost altogether.
Your problem.
Oh, wait, I know this one.
You are!
So in talking about the show universe or story world, I always mean how this show casts its version of reality. The setting, yes, but also the rhythm and regularities to how its characters speak and act, what's considered normal, the multi-layered physics of the universe. Now, even in season 1, this storytelling element was kind of a mixed bag. Yes, the tone and cadence of the dialogue was distinct and welcoming and very well done.
So, I spoke to the owner of the Sun.
You spoke to God?
But the show didn't seem to know exactly to what extent it was supposed to mirror our reality versus create a cartoonish new one. But that was fine, because in that first season, it really didn't matter. The world was very tightly wound around the central narrative. Sort of like how the banking system and society at large in Harry Potter really makes no sense, but it's never involved that much, so who really cares? But as you move away from a centralized narrative, as the Ted Lasso universe became more like an underlying platform for a handful of unrelated stories, the construction and consistency of the story world becomes more and more important. This trend, launching one cohesive narrative in a loosely defined world and then using later seasons as umbrellas for untethered subplots, is also present in another Apple TV show, Mythic Quest, so I don't know if they're experimenting or what out there, but anyway, let's get into it. So, as with the show's broader approach to storytelling, the biggest problem with the Ted Lasso universe is that it was evidently sort of made up as things went along. There are a few indications. So firstly, I think it's pretty clear that Sudeikis viewed all aspects of culture, society, and media as up for grabs when it came to reference and humor. Ted Lasso was very well known for being very saturated with references to American and KC-specific culture, and that's totally fine. Sudeikis has said that he learned from Monty Python to make references that work even for people who don't particularly know them, and I think he succeeds. That rom-com ode episode, Rainbow, is definitely one of my favorites. And I'm aware that I might be sounding unduly pedantic here, but it was nonetheless clear to me that Sudeikis didn't think through the broader meaning of some of those references, and just sort of grabbed what he thought would work well in the moment. So, for example, in 2 instances, Ted comforts Beard after tough losses by saying the phrase "bird by bird." Works out of context, but it's also a reference to the book Bird by Anne Lamott. This is a great book on writing, which I do recommend, and the title comes from a very sweet childhood memory of hers. So basically, it was the end of summer break. Her brother had had a report on birds due, but as a kid, just being a kid, he hadn't even started it. But instead of freaking out, their dad sat down, put his arm around his son, and told him they'd work through it together, just taking it bird by bird. Anne is obviously a very talented writer, so unsurprisingly, this anecdote in the book is a beautiful insight into her father and what kind of family she comes from and what values we're going to expect as we read it. But if you're thinking that this little story could fit right into our show Ted Lasso, you're right, because at the end of season 2, Ted shares a story from his childhood, saying he had had a month to read a book for a big test the next day, and as a kid just being a kid, he hadn't started it. He thought his dad would freak out, but instead, his dad told him not to worry, go to bed, and the next day on the way to school, his dad walked through the book chapter by chapter, having stayed up all night to spare his kid the anxiety. Are they exactly the same? No, but to me, the tactic of dropping this kind of efficiently meaningful childhood anecdote is a clear instance of borrowing from Anne's book, especially since we already know Sudeikis has clearly read it. And whether or not you think this kind of borrowing is fine is up to you. Personally, I find this approach to engaging with existing media pretty weird. Like, either give a nod to the title or make a more underlying reference, I guess. Just doing both seems kind of sloppy to me. There's also another potentially pedantic sounding example, but this time I know from an interview that Sudeikis conceived of the reference at the very last minute. So back in season 1, he needed a big confrontation scene with Jamie. He was struggling to write it, and as he was falling asleep one night, he came up with the very memorable Iverson reference scene. So for those who don't know, basketball legend Allen Iverson was questioned by press about missing practice shortly after the death of his friend, and he gave this now famous, incredulous response. It's often treated as a joke, but really it highlights the insignificance of something like practice compared to the scope of life and death. And Sudeikis, as Ted, fully inverted Iverson's meaning, instead stressing the significance of practice as this sort of sacred place where it's just us. It's the only time it's just the team. To me, it's sort of unclear whether this is written as a reference that Sudeikis is making through Ted, or if Ted is making it himself, but either way, my frustration here is that it's just played for the moment. This doesn't really speak to Ted's coaching strategy or outlook at all. Indeed, in season 3, he invites the entirety of Richmond fans to come watch training. It's not just to them. And I'm not trying to call plot hole or anything. It's not even incompatible with who Ted is. But a more thoughtful approach to intertextuality with stories in our reality would contribute broader thematic meaning, or at the very least inform us about our characters. As often is the case in this show, the scene really does work, but it doesn't clue us in on the broader narrative. And while I admire Sudeikis' last-minute creativity, definitely, it also contributes to the explanation as to why season 3 felt so random. It was. And this sort of lackadaisical approach to references was true for the show's inspiration for its structural design. As already reviewed, season 1 was built on structural intertextuality with beloved classics like Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, The Wizard of Oz, and it's obviously fine not to follow them to a T all the way to the end. But again, even infrastructure was involved sorta haphazardly, and we dipped in and out or nodded to this surface level only. Secondly, Ted Lasso was increasingly sort of silly as it went on, and obviously, yeah, the premise itself is outlandish, but it's treated as outlandish by everyone in the universe. You know, why the hell is this American guy here to coach us? And Ted Lasso always had a bit of a cartoonish bounce to it. To be honest, personally, I would have preferred if it didn't, if the sets looked a little less clean, if players actually looked sweaty and gritty and dirty after games. I think it would have lent credence to the optimistic voice, but that's just my preference. The more substantial problem is the increasing absurdity throughout the seasons. In season 1, only Ted talked like Ted. That was a feature. Everyone else was sort of a straight man for him to bounce off of. But in season 3, everyone is cracking wholesome jokes, making puns, and that's one thing, but my patience really snapped with the season 3 penis strings training. So to learn total football, they connect players by strings attached to their penises, and it's treated like this goofy little joke. This isn't just too goofy for my personal humor, although along with the litany of actual poop jokes that we got this season, that's certainly true. Remember, this is not a kid's show. It actually undermined the general stakes of the universe. So in season 1, a pulled muscle mattered. It was taken seriously. This would have resulted in immediate and ubiquitous catastrophic injuries. I know I'm sounding like kind of nitpicky here, but it was honestly very hard to take this scene seriously and then anything after that seriously as well. And on that note, some bizarre inconsistencies in this story world also undermined Ted Lasso's moral authority as a show, which wouldn't matter if the show wasn't so heavily defined by being a sort of optimistically progressive therapy zone. With that in mind, it's really weird that numerous problematic workplace relationships occur without the show making any sort of point about them, which again, would be absolutely fine in a different show, but this season in particular left no social issues stone unturned. They also spent 2 seasons going well out of their way to show Beard's relationship with Jane as troubling if not abusive, and there's a great moment with him and Higgins about it. But instead of grappling with that moral gray zone, the show just ended up not caring about it. In the finale, it's not just Ted who's like, okay Beard, go get her. The show itself bathed this relationship in humor and warmth. These cracks in the parameters of predictability made it hard to inhabit the universe, impossible to predict dramatic consequences for basic character decision-making, and this is frustrating because Ted Lasso big time sold itself on its own world. Not just in touring the White House to promote mental health work, but even consumer products like the FIFA game, and particularly as Season 3 worked as a platform for all sorts of random hijinks, the show overlooked some easy opportunities right at the show's doorstep that could have made this a really cohesive and inviting place. As discussed in my Gilmore Girls review, rhythm and regularity can be great tools to build up a cohesive and inviting story world, and Season 1 of Ted Lasso laid some groundwork in that arena through Biscuits with the Boss, Ted and Beard in the pub, Ted's walk to work, but it would have been great to build a more robustly consistent rhythm for regular episodes. Maybe every week is game week, maybe there's always a press conference after every game, maybe there's regular corporate meetings. That way, deviations like big away games would feel fresh to us, and we could sense more of a divide between, the upstairs, downstairs worlds, the corporate offices versus the locker room. Spaces, settings, buses could be heightened to have a visceral, rhythmic effect. And, of course, by far, the most underutilized storytelling tool was the sport itself. I understand that many viewers were relieved that this wasn't a sports show, but I think those people are underestimating how wonderful sports can be for storytelling. I actually wanted to see Ted doing his job. That season 1 idea of making the extra pass was a simple, sort of cheesy, and absolutely perfect metaphor for this show to use and create a world around the sport itself. That pivot to total football this season could have been fantastic as well, and we don't need any knowledge of the Premier League or the sports to understand this, and there were just so many more easy metaphors right there, like play the ball the direction you're facing, stay goal side of your man, look to open space, but also, more importantly, opportunities for character work. Not just literally announcing to us, Colin is now good, hooray! Give these guys something real to struggle against and overcome in the game, and show us the gameplay. For the love of God, make us involved, make me excited for matches. I can't tell you how much I wanted to care about Richmond, about this universe. I actively wanted to be a part of it, but I just couldn't.
Believing that things can get better, that I can get better, that we will get better.
So, to review, we've looked at narrative persuasion, character work, and the Ted Lasso story universe, all as demonstrations of how this show launched with solid, centralized story organization, but, through contrast with seasons 1 and 3, demonstrated a lack of consistent care for core storytelling fundamentals, making way for a disjointed, unsatisfying season 3. And there was some groundwork laid for what could have been a decent final season. Money and the sort of shady corporate side of the sport could have been major themes. Zava, maybe he could have demanded a fatter contract, which could give Keeley something relevant to do. Maybe Rebecca considers selling the club to Edwin Akufo or something because she doesn't have a need for it anymore. She doesn't need revenge. And for a season-long backburner development, she could slowly fall in love with the game itself, as she sort of professes to do in the version we get. Maybe that's what the point of her relationship with Sam was. Maybe Jamie is so insulted that Richmond think they need Zava that he goes crazy trying to train up, which is sort of what we get. But through his menteeship with Roy, maybe Jamie realizes how unhealthy his relationship with football always was, ultimately perhaps even quitting. Maybe Ted's son Henry consistently acts out at school. Not the quickly resolved pseudo-mention that we get, but a longer-term problem. And Ted could connect the way he coaches with the way that he's a father, realizing that he's sort of neglecting his kid, and that's why Henry's acting out. And maybe that's exactly what happened between Ted and Nate as well. And seeing this connection, maybe while, overhearing Danny say football is life or something, that's what prompts Ted's discovery of total football. And if Zava lands at West Ham instead, they can't beat him man-to-man, but they can as a seamless squad. I haven't added anything here. It was all right there. Those were all things that were incorporated into this season. It doesn't have to be exactly what I just outlined, but there was something simple and unified like that buried in this season. It just got senselessly shredded and overwhelmed under goat poop and baklava. I also have to add the throwaway point that this show's music does it no favors. It seems a bit strong to say, but it was pretty tonally condescending, as if we need these cues to know how to feel about things. And maybe this is one reason why some people rather intuitively disliked this show right off the bat. There's definitely a case to be made that it lacks confidence in its own audience's ability to interpret and be involved. I mean, in this season, every emotional pivot was extraordinarily explicit and one note. And look, sometimes I'll get all annoyed at Ted Lasso, as I have been here, and then I'll watch a beautiful show clip and feel like I just punched my own teddy bear, but weirdly, I think a fair few of Ted Lasso's best moments actually work best out of context. And that speaks to the writer's ability to articulate simple societal truths and undervalued human ethics. But even some of Ted Lasso's most iconic moments don't actually make a ton of cohesive sense.
Because if they were curious, they would ask questions. Questions like, have you played a lot of darts, Ted?
Do you like darts, Ted?
Oh,
Okay,
And again, to me, it seems like they saw how much we liked scenes like that and then dumped dozens more onto season 3, doubling down on the show's popular reception instead of the show's core purpose. Storytelling requires forethought, organization, intentional use of fundamentals. A lot of complex work has to go into delivering something simple, and naming emotions, no matter how poignant or resonant they are in our society, is not the same as dramatizing them through the art of story. And to me, there is no denying that season 1 was pretty magic, that Jason Sudeikis did something special with the avuncular cadence to Ted's humor juxtaposed by his sad clown moments of loneliness. It might not be for you, but it was pretty good, and even at the show's worst, it did a good, if not great, job of creating a tonally comfortable space for people to check into week by week. It just didn't do so through the art of storytelling. And because I do care about this show, because a lot of talent and heart went into it, because I believe in what it once was and could have been, I am still pretty frustrated that it seemingly went out of its way to spurn the craft of storytelling. It basically took the same approach as Coach Lasso did, as if just showing up and being nice was enough and we'd all be swept away by saccharine humor and optimistic charm, and you know what? Some people were. But it's my fervent opinion that this show made great initial strides by earning popular and critical attention through cohesive and organized storytelling, and that its established social status was a distinct privilege, to have the resources, platform, and audience that it did, and in an age where art has to fight to exist under the immense, bulking weight of bland content, where shows that are designed to make us feel more have to squeeze in amongst all the shows designed to make us feel less, and particularly with its self-assigned authorial ethos of representing the concept of goodness and kindness, Ted Lasso had an artistic responsibility to itself and to the world, and it massively dropped the ball. But as ever, thank you so much for watching. This was obviously a negative review, but it was made with deep care for both the show and storytelling. I hope that comes through. And if you're keen for more, please do subscribe and also do comment with any other shows you'd like to unpack. Thank you so much, guys.